Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the CSH for for the last seminar session of this semester. This evening, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Saeed Ahmad from Jindal University. So Dr. Saeed Ahmad is assistant professor at the Jindal School of Art and Architecture at Jindal Global University. He received his PhD from the Center for Modern Indian Studies at the University of Göttingen in Germany. His work is at the intersection of history, sociology, and human geography, and looks at Delhi's long 20th century history through questions of migration, heritage, displacement, memory, infrastructures, and religious conflict. Saeed is currently preparing a monograph based on his PhD project, which was entitled City on the Move, Migration, Public Culture, Urban Identity in India, from 1911 to the present. And he looks at it through a contemporary neighborhood microhistory for Delhi in the 20th century. This monograph looks at shifting caste, class, spatial, and religious conjunctions that affect state legibility, civic and political access to craft space, community, and belonging in the neighborhood and the city. And Saeed is also part of a new collaboration, which is a transdisciplinary British Academy funded project that looks at questions of sacred urbanism, heritage, and diaspora worlding. So this evening, he will come and present a talk entitled Morality, Legality, Enterprise, Infrastructures and Space in a Delhi Neighborhood. But before I let him present his work, I'd like to introduce his discussant. So we're very happy to welcome Dr. Dia Mehra this evening, who's a senior assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at South Asia University. So her interests lie in considering the production of spaces in South Asia, both historically and in the contemporary. Her writings have been published in several leading academic journals, and they focus on, first of all, Delhi's urbanization in the 20th century, then economic liberalization and its impact on Indian metropolitan cities. Third, she looks at contemporary urbanization processes as witnessed and experienced in small Indian towns and rural hinterlands, and including through the building of new infrastructure. And then she also looks at the construction of wilderness and natural environments, quote unquote, in colonial India. Previously, she was also visiting faculty at the School of Planning and Architecture, and she was actually a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre de Sciences Humaines, at the CSH, which is why she knows this place pretty well. She was also a researcher at the Sarai CSDS program, and she's currently a part of the editorial collective of Society and Culture in South Asia. She also teaches at South Asian University, and her teaching focuses on urban studies, including new forms of planetary urbanization, as well as qualitative research methods and ethnographic writing. So thank you again to both Dr. Ahmed and Dr. Mehra for being with us this evening. I will now, just for those of you who are not familiar with the format of our seminars, we'll start with a 40-minute presentation followed by 15 minutes of discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions both online and in the room. Thank you again.
Thank you, Laurence. And thanks to CSH for giving me the opportunity to present my work. Thanks to Dia for agreeing to be a discussant. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So first, I'm going to sort of, this paper is part of my larger project, my larger monograph that looks at Delhi's long 20th century. So there will be aspects that I'll sort of contextualize certain things that are not directly part of the paper, but will help set the stage for the discussion. But first, I want to begin with the story. In late 2021, news of a theka, colloquialism for liquor stores or beer and wine shops, opening close to the entrance to the neighborhood Jangpura-Bhogal began circulating. Claims of morality and legality motivated the first formal call to mobilization, which appeared on 7th November 2021. It highlighted the danger of the site and the practices that the space could potentially facilitate. It was speculated that the shop owner acquired the license through his contacts with the MLA, Praveen Kumar. Apart from allegations of collusion and land use violations, residents drew attention to the seemingly unsightly activities accompanying liquor consumption, smoking, vomiting, and public urination that would affect the safety and security of women and children. This moral claim was accompanied by arguments of a disruptive economic transformation. The wine shop would cause a loss of tenants and a dip in property prices. Citing the historical absence of liquor stores in the neighborhood and the failed attempts to open one near the Shiv temple 3 years ago, residents urged for a stay order and a signature campaign for an application to the Nizamuddin and Jangpura police posts. Subsequent meetings organized were attended by the Bhogal Traders Association, Aam Aadmi Party's Jangpura unit, resident welfare associations, that is the JEWA and the JRWA, residents of Jangpura A and Bhogal, locally based member of the Delhi Commission for Women, Sarika Chaudhary, and MLA Praveen Kumar. Support was also garnered through the Facebook pages connected to these collectives. However, this furor against the liquor store was not an isolated incident. In the coming days, the area of Daryaganj witnessed a similar mobilization with the support of BJP and AAP MLAs. These protests were in response to the Delhi government's recent decision to deregulate and disinvest from the liquor business in the city. As per the new regulations of the Delhi excise policy, private vendors would replace all government-run liquor stores, marking an end to the Delhi government's control to about 60% of the city's liquor market. The policy was moved to expand the Delhi government's purse, crack down on the liquor mafia, and facilitate the expansion of a modern liquor business in the city, that is, premium liquor stores and home delivery of alcohol. These rules would come into force on 17 November 2021 when all government-run stores would shut down. Soon, the local BJP unit organized a protest to question the Delhi government's policies, invoking issues of public morality and the damaging effect it could have on children's psyche. These protests and letters to the authority could not prevent the opening of the shop, however. As a result, residents of Bhogal and Jangpura A began protesting at the site to disrupt its sales and use social media to mobilize public support. Women and senior citizens were urged to take the lead in the protests, the shop reinventing thali bajao or clang utensils to disrupt customers entering the store, while the men blocked the street to disrupt customers and traffic. By the evening, the numbers increased, utensils continued clanging, and the slogans became louder. Residents drew attention to the haphazard parking by customers and untiringly continued to disrupt the store's transactions. As a result, the proprietors shut the store early and provided ample space for a larger crowd of protesters to join, who brought placards and began painting graffiti on the shop shutters. As MLA Praveen Kumar, INC MCD Daryaganj Ward Councillor Yasmin Kidwai, and the local BJP unit became regulars, a permanent protest staging area that you can see on the screen was established at the base of the stairwell leading to the shop. Throughout the day, the garlanded corpse of a liquor store on a beer or arthi was guarded by different protesters who were provided meals by the women of Jangpura A. The Sai Mandir and the Maida Gurdwara, close by religious spaces, also organized kirtans and parts at the same space and distributed langar, that eventually attracted even larger crowds. Such candlelight vigils, multiple letters to government officials, continued protests and media coverage were followed by petitions from residents and Sarika Chaudhary against the shop in the Delhi High Court. The court indulged these legal appeals, which argued that no liquor store could be within 100 meters of social, religious, or cultural institutions. Just to give a sense, like this is a map of the approximate the religious institutions. So the street on which it was happening has a site has a religious site almost every 100 meters. The Delhi administration soon jumped into action and began measuring the exact distance of the store to religious sites marked in the petition. As social media was abuzz with discussions and questions of public morality and religious blasphemy, another actor entered the fray. The BJP-led SDMC, or the South Delhi Municipal Corporation, vowed to suspend licenses of stores in violation of the excise policy, including payment of conversion charges, completion certificates, property tax returns, building bylaws, and licensing norms. Following the excise department's response to the High Court, the liquor store's license was revoked and the store shut down by 3rd December 2021. a month later. This agitation was important for a few political aspirants in the build-up to the 2022 MCT elections, particularly for the Siddharth Nagar and the Daryaganj wards. Of course, the key players in this did not win, and other candidates sort of succeeded in winning the election. So it was sort of counterproductive for them. Through this agitation, Jangpura-Bhogal's social and material infrastructures came together. The fluid socio-spatial boundaries between Bhogal and Jangpura A were mobilized to recruit protesters against the liquor shop through ideas of fear, morality, public practice, and ideal urban space. The street, public parks, social media, and religious spaces served as arenas of protest. Residents, religious spaces, political units, MCD representatives, members of legislative assemblies, the market trader associations, the resident welfare associations, banded together to define the market space. These alliances forged emerged from historically spatial proximities, socio-economic relations, political histories, and aspirations formed around infrastructural space. If you can see, these are the sort of connections that that emerged from this particular agitation, but they have, and what I'm trying to essentially argue is that while we have, it is the Theka agitation is very symptomatic of mediatized middle class publics in millennial Delhi, and through legislative measures like the Bhagidari scheme. It also emerges from a longer history of collective endeavors to craft social space in the city. So what I'm going to do essentially in this paper is actually unpack this longer history by providing historical snapshots across Jangpura-Bhogal's 20th century. Of course, since it's a long time period, I can't provide really deep histories, but these snapshots I'm hoping should provide a glimpse into this more extended history. So in doing this, I'm reconsidering and sort of thinking about the scholarly claims of a neoliberal disjuncture in middle class politics that has been argued by unpacking a longer history that provides the foundation for contemporary RWA and MTA practices. So I'm going to try and introduce the space that I work on. So if you can see, the Jangpura-Bhogal is basically these 5 neighborhoods. Jangpura B, Bhogal, Jangpura Extension, Jangpura A, and Pantnagar, which is in the southeast part of Delhi. And it's broadly a middle-class neighborhood area with dispersed slum populations around the river belt, and some in the Pantnagar neighborhood. And according to 2011 census, since of course we don't have 2021 census figures, that's about approximately 35,631. And it's seen 3 major waves of migrations, which is from 1922, when you had the settlement and relocation of villages displaced for the new capital project, from the Imperial Delhi area, laid out in a very distinct grade pattern with segregated micro localities of different castes and communities. This was quite similar along the lines of model settlements that William Glover talks about, where spatial relations of inhabitation were changed in the hope to sort of civilize populations while keeping the social dynamics intact. Then you have 1947, where you have a small percentage of Muslims who actually depart following the partition, either leaving for Muslim majority areas, having been killed, or to Pakistan, the arrival of Hindu and Sikh refugees, and the expansion of the neighborhood. So in the post-1980s, you see the arrival of Kashmiri Muslims, itinerant traders who started settling down after the breakout of the Kashmir insurgency, Afghan Muslims who started arriving after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then in large numbers actually with the rise of the Taliban in the mid-1990s, and slum settlements that emerged with the city's expansion in the 1980s, when it required a large pool of labor for its expansion. So its current social makeup is about diverse Dalit populations, caste Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, Muslims, Thai and Indian Buddhists, Ravidasyas, and Christians. As Diya Mehra and Sanjay Srivastav have argued, RWAs have existed since the 1950s and were often set up by retired military men functioning through meager donations by residents and advocating for basic infrastructural services like park and street maintenance. An example from this neighborhood are the Jangpura extension and the Pantnagar associations established in 1951 and 1958. Such associations in urban India existed alongside more prominent urban or regional migrant associations working to organize refugee and migrant housing and infrastructures in Bombay and Calcutta. Here I'm referring to the work of Nikhil Rao and Rita Jyoti Bandyopadhyay. In Delhi, organizations like the Refugee Association, the Frontier Purusharthi Jirga, and the Sindhi Association regularly organized public meetings in the early 1950s to address refugee problems and communicate with the state. According to the Registrar of Societies, Jangpura-Bhogal has 33 societies, professional, religious, social, educational, residential, and trade, registered under the Societies Registration Act of 1860. While some of these organizations mainly utilize Jangpura-Bhogal as a base of operations, the trader and resident associations are rooted in the locality. They exist alongside more informal collectives around particular colonies, streets, or localities, utilizing often public parks, religious sites as meeting spaces, but also social media pages, so Facebook pages, Twitter profiles, WhatsApp groups to communicate with their members. Some of these are the ones that you can see on your screen. For example, the Jangpura Extension Residents Association was actually formed after the then MLA had a fallout with members of the Jangpura Residents Welfare Association. So this was a counter that was set up. And there are, in these neighborhoods, you have a bunch of them who actually stand for the entire area, some for particular streets, particular localities, but they all sort of connected to each other through sort of political membership, access to the same religious spaces, historic relations. So now we can sort of start moving on to the instances that I've been sort of talking about, right? So first we go back into the colonial period and we sort of think about how its ideas of public health and in the colonial quarters, and especially in the what they call the native settlements, relied on the idea that material reforms through orthogonal streets, modern amenities like electricity, drainage systems, piped water supply, healthcare, would initiate social change among these populations. This was also combined with the Garden City articulation of New Delhi, an arbitrary and at times farcical distinction between the old and the new city, as Stephen Legg has shown through his brilliant work, and perpetual concerns about relieving congestion influenced not only Delhi, but Jangpura-Bhogal's infrastructural life. The NDMC provided with filtered water supply to these villages right at the edge of the Imperial Delhi area, particularly Jangpura village and Nizamuddin village. Police constables would soon replace chowkidars, and the Jangpura dispensary was established in 1930 to cater to a population about 4,000 people in the surrounding villages. A decade later, it was joined by a child welfare center that catered to the needs of pregnant women, housing a doctor and 2 nurses. Of course, this is also a period that sees the haphazard growth of Delhi, marked by slums, congestion, housing crunch, spiraling land prices, especially shown by Anish Vinayak's work and also Diya's work, which also took over all Nazoon crown lands, including Jangpura village. So the Delhi Improvement Trust essentially came into place to sort of change the scenario. But then you had the partition, the mass refugee influx, the quick fix refugee constructions, which exacerbated congestion and the unplanned growth, leading to the replacement of the DIT with the DDA in 1957. To address this urban chaos, the Delhi Master Plan of 1962 drew on American and German town planning ideas to establish industrial zones, regulate, determine strict land use patterns, and develop ring towns or counter magnets within the larger Delhi metropolitan area. At the time, Delhi, under president's rule with the nominal legislative assembly and active TMC, was ruled by the Congress, which was victorious in 1958 and 1962, even though the Jan Sangh kept making inroads, supporting a temple agitation in Jangpura. The Hindi movement as part of the larger Punjabi Suba movement of the late 1950s and resident attempts to craft space. Of course, this is also a time when you see a number of collectives that are emerging amongst residents. And the first instance is when the Congress swept the Lok Sabha and Legislative Assembly elections in 1951-52, also winning in the New Delhi constituency, which included Jangpura-Bhogal at the time. Delhi's first elected chief minister, Chaudhry Brahm Prakash, was touring the refugee localities. Here you can see results of legislative assembly elections. I mean, Metropolitan Council and legislative assembly elections, which I was able to gather through a scarce neighborhood archive. There is some data is not available for certain election years because of the scarcity of the archive. But you can see the constituencies boundaries keep changing, and it has largely been, apart from the Lok Sabha, it's largely been a stronghold for the Indian National Congress and the Aam Aadmi Party. So Delhi's first elected chief minister, Chaudhry Brahm Prakash, was touring the refugee localities of Delhi to take stock of the construction work underway. There he encountered a combined deputation of the residents of Lajpat Nagar, Jangpura, Bhogal and Nizamuddin, who submitted a joint memorandum. The document submitted was an exhaustive appeal by representative organizations in the 4 neighborhoods requesting the government to address their difficulties. It covered public amenities, educational institutions, economic necessities, religious and social life, and health services. The language marked a tone of orders and suggestions to the government. As Ravinder Kaur's work has shown, this language of rightful expectations was common in post-partition Delhi, as upper caste and upper class refugees were often increasingly assertive of the state's responsibility towards them. The memorandum argued for the reduction or removal of shops and house rents, infrastructural additions like electricity poles and sewer constructions, adequate political representation, construction of social infrastructures like allotments for religious sites, cremation grounds, community halls, parks, boosting the local economy through an earmarked industrial area, promotion of cottage industries, and the improvements in the markets, connecting the neighborhood through transportation networks, such as the bus and rail services, and providing concessions on travel. Now, the refugees submitting this memorandum in 1954 were the inheritors of very prevalent colonial buildings and services. While, of course, due to the nature of the archive, the direct outcome of these demands for infrastructural interventions in the space is difficult to trace. A few transformations can be observed. By 1954, you had the establishment of the Delhi Municipal Corporation through the DMC Act of 1957, which combined 12 different bodies of Delhi civic administration into one. The establishment of the Delhi Metropolitan Council in 1967, consisting of elected representatives, which, however, was limited to an advisory role with the Lieutenant Governor's office. The Jansang's work would come to fruition and it enjoyed consecutive victories in the Metropolitan Council and DMC elections in 1967, establishing dominance over politics in the city. And the effect of it is discussed by Nazima Parveen, according basically around the meat agitations that accompanied the rise of the Jansang in the 1960s. The Congress's return to power was briefly interrupted by the post-emergency influence of the Janata Dal in 1977. By 1961, you see the expansion of the suburban railways to these colonies, the expansion of the dispensary, and the maintenance of the DMC coming in to maintain several parks. Now, these collective demands to improve the live space emerged through a very organizational effort on the part of residents of these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were all spatially proximate to each other. And it was formed through a variety of relations emerging at the time. This included market relations, as the Bhogal market was a very, very central sort of key nodal point for agricultural trade in that part of the city. The setting up of the Lajpat Nagar market, which also became a major trading point, it still is, just like Bhogal. There were familial connections of shared histories of displacement that had taken place and allotments that had emerged, emerging public and religious space interactions, shared refugee camps, camp histories, because most of these refugees came from shared sort of 4 or 5 refugee camps in the city. These, what Uditi Sen has called the citizen refugees, tapped into the emergent relations and interactions to express a combined request to improve urban space. Many other instances would follow around this time. This included something like educational institutions. So, by the 1920s, the Cambridge Mission had established a number of schools in the neighborhood. And these were added to by the Sanatan Dharma Society and the New Delhi Municipal Corporation, which started in the 1950s, basically after 1947, to establish educational institutions, such as the DAV School, which was started actually in 1945, but also the SD High School, which came in the 1950s. However, during the expansion of such educational institutions, we also see a concerted process by residents negotiating with the plan and the state to establish infrastructural space. Following the construction of Jangpura extension, debates began about relocating a Jain school that had been running in Bhogal for several years, applying for land in the upcoming neighborhood. Residents objected to this allotment and the construction of temporary school buildings. The reason was its relocation to a particular site in Jangpura extension, opposite a recently constructed cinema, which we know as Eros Cinema, for those familiar with Jangpura. Now, in the court injunctions submitted by the residents and petitions to the chief commissioner at the time, the residents highlighted the violations of the intended land use, citing the cinematography rules of 1953 that prohibited the construction of cinemas within 250 meters of religious spaces, educational institutions, and hospitals. Inquiries by the Ministry of Works, Housing and Supply found that the Rehabilitation Ministry had allotted the land without consulting the Ministry of Education in January 1962. Although in violation of the Act, the allotment was made based on the layout plan stipulation for a school. However, Jangpura Extension's residents were, of course, not happy and began a campaign to prevent the school's functioning through petitions, filing more injunctions, visits to important political figures, such as the Bharatiya Jansang's Lok Sabha representative, Balraj Madhok, who took it up in Parliament. Again, they argued, they used the discourse of public morality, that a girls' school in front of a cinema would have a harmful effect on young students. The reasoning was that the cinema would usually attract bad crowds and thugs in the evenings close to its show timings. Resonating with newspaper and editorial debates in Delhi at the time about the negative effects of cinema culture on public morality. Residents claimed this was a period of great crime in the city and the neighborhood, which had witnessed murders, kidnappings, and arson directed at the nearby police post. They also cited anxieties about the circulation of unknown bodies due to the Lajpat Nagar railway stop and link road located very close to this space. It served as entry and exit points to Jangpura extension. They further argued that the neighborhood already had 3 schools functioning and there was no need for an additional educational institution. Now, their objection was, one of their first objections was that the institution primarily catered to, as they called, outsider residents from Bhogal and Lajpat Nagar, and none from Jangpura extension itself. Therefore, shifting a pre-partition school to a partition colony was undesirable, and the older school building was adequate to serve the residents' needs. Secondly, they again brought in questions of land use and planning, arguing that the site was initially intended for a post office, a bank, and a public park. According to the residents, what had further happened was that the construction of a boundary wall by the non-resident Jain society had disfigured the colony and created some slum-like conditions. They had converted the place into a polluted spot, a place of bad smell, as they argued. This place was being used by cinema goers, as they argued, as a urinal at the time of intervals. Furthermore, the boundary wall encroaching more land than it was allotted, covering the drain, would interrupt future infrastructural projects like road extensions, eventually leading to drainage and rainwater collection problems. Moreover, shops had been subleased from that area, which started to serve a commercial rather than in educational purposes. While the government was, the WHS ministry was hesitant to actually remove the site, this sort of public pressure actually did have an effect. Eventually, the school was removed from what the archive I can gather. It was removed, and now there are only parks there. And but more importantly, this instance, amongst like the previous instance, we see resident attempts to displace an educational institution due to its alleged land use violations and the infrastructural needs of a present and local population. Violations of intended land use produced an absence of infrastructure vital to these residents. Such a presence-absence dynamic continued to influence other instances in Jangpura-Bhogal. Now we come to the question of the, how much time do I have? Okay, yeah, so I'm doing good. By 1927, Jangpura-Bhogal's Bania and Jain-run grain market traded agricultural produce like jaggery, corn, and flour for nearby villages. It also hosted banking businesses, grain storage houses, small Muslim-run oil presses, and meat establishments, concrete factories, small-scale piggeries, a stone quarry for various colonial infrastructural projects, and minor agricultural holdings. Of course, with independence partition and the attendant urban explosion, the market expanded, bringing several newspaper offices, small manufacturing units, and other businesses to the city and the neighborhood. By the 1950s, as Jangpura started transforming into Jangpura-Bhogal, housing accompanied the construction of shops and shop-cum residences for refugees. In this process, the Ministry of Refugee Relief and Rehabilitation had to contend with an inefficient and underfunded Delhi Improvement Trust that would transfer the land to them. The rapid constructions accompanied a rise in land prices around the Jangpura-Bhogal area and Delhi owing to massive land speculation that had been underway since 1912. Underfunded municipal and civic institutions and grand but continuously failing urban development schemes like the Western Extension or the Ajmeri Gate schemes of an earlier time prompted the DIT to use every opportunity to realize rents and revenues from leased land. Okay, this one, yeah. Here is where the older residents of Jangpura village came in, submitting a petition to Nehru in July 1955, appealing to their historical presence and displacement from erstwhile villages to Jangpura-Bhogal. They protested the DIT's U-turn in the earlier exemption given to pre-trust shops from paying rents and premiums on leases. The issue arose around the mutation or the conversion of residential plots into residential-cum-commercial plots. This was in response to a recent legislation regarding the change of user plots that had superseded earlier orders. The DIT alleged that user change was rampant in Jangpura and its sort of sister settlement, Karol Bagh, which I can talk about after in the question answer session, and thus required immediate government attention to prevent urban disorder and realize revenue. The shop owners, of course, had no option but to complete the required payments. This was, of course, not the first instance where such an incident had happened. And the shopkeepers persisting to the state to cater to their demands. In 1954, we see another instance where, in this time, they are more successful than the previous time. The elements of efficient zoning and land use were on display when objections arose around these motor workshops in Jangpura. Motor workshops were primarily owned by the earlier Baniyas and Jains and newcomer Jains, Sikhs and Hindus comprising owners and rentiers, established on pre-existing and recently purchased evacuee properties. Such a mammoth requirement, it was suggested, could be satisfied by the newly planned upcoming Okhla industrial estate, a potential model industrial colony. However, since it was meant to cater to productive rather than maintenance industries, it was not the ideal space for their relocation. In addition, complaints by some plot owners against the rentiers running these shops revived the questions of appropriate land use against residential plots utilized for commercial purposes. The proprietors, represented through the Jangpura Motor Workshop Association, claimed that they had a pre-existing agreement with the former NDMC chairman, that these shops were granted licenses and were therefore not illegal. While they agreed to be relocated, they approached the courts for restitution. Meanwhile, a plan to acquire of 76 acres near the Okhla industrial estate was underway, but required time to be developed. As a result, it was decided to withdraw, cancel suspension notices, and stop issuing notices of criminal proceedings against such transgressions. Later, the NDMC resolved to renew the current licenses of these workshops and urged for their relocation at the earliest time possible. Eventually, they came to a solution and they planned to relocate these shops to the industrial belt near the Hindustan housing factory that had been set up in the liminal zone between Jangpura-Bhogal and Lajpat Nagar. The JMWA agreed to the relocation. However, the shopkeepers requested to continue their businesses and not be bothered by the state authorities until the land was developed. Here we see the success of such a demand made as these shops continued for the longest time, well into the 80s and 90s. Some of them were relocated, but others still remain till this day. Now I'm just going to start concluding. These historical and contemporary relations have produced several collectives mobilized during moments of crisis to negotiate with larger urban, national, and global processes to craft the neighborhood, its imaginaries and practices. For the locals, this collective would emerge during persistent sealing drives that rocked the city in 2006, 2008, and recently in 2018. These continued actions against what are called encroachers on government land have been important opportunities for the rise of MTAs and RWAs as pivotal figures in local urban politics. In 2022, for example, the BJP's demands to shut meat shops during Navratri met resistance as the Bhogal Vyapar Samiti or the Market Traders Association, Bhogal Traders Association, supported Jangpura-Bhogal Sikh and Muslim meat sellers, resisting this majoritarian and economically disastrous move by the government. When seen within a more extended history, the Theka agitation that I referred to at the beginning of this presentation combine these long-standing socio-economic relations to determine legality, morality, and enterprise in Jangpura-Bhogal. In earlier work, I have highlighted the role of such collectives in the production of religious spaces, communal claims to space, erasure of spaces now absent, of now absent populations, slum demolitions, and narrative erasures of claims to space, all facilitated through the conjunction of diverse actors and institutions. Here, I have tried to document the production of diverse infrastructures in these populations who have differential access to the state, but also all of these processes, including the ones I haven't mentioned, but I'd be happy to talk about them. But they've involved shifting caste, class, and religious conjunctions. one thing that it shows is that market relations, apart from historical residence and spatial proximity, have also been vital to not only neighborhood sociality, but also its social infrastructures. In a recent volume, Sebastian Schweck and Ajay Gandhi draw on historical studies of markets to argue that they are key sites and enablers of sociality, reputation, and trust. Historically durable and shifting networks of community, ethnic, religious, spatial, gender, and power, political, economic, continue to affect not only markets, but also their material and immaterial relations. Naturally, these instances explored above play out in the domain of civil society, actions initiated by what Partha Chatterjee would call rights-bearing citizens. While his categories of civil and political society do provide a necessary differentiation between citizens and populations, the urban poor and marginalized rightfully must rely on often illicit or illegal acts to stake their claims on urban space as rights-bearing citizens through a variety of local, social, and political intermediaries. Naturally, questions of substantive citizenship rights must be negotiated with the state seeking to manage and provide basic welfare to populations and the disjuncture between policy and practice. However, studies by Shirupa Roy, Diamera, Rukmini Barua, among many others, have questioned Partha Chatterjee's binaries of civil and political society. While civil society as an interventionist political project is demographically limited, its practices often overlap with those of political society. RWAs and MTAs in Delhi and urban metropolises continue to participate in everyday activities of infrastructural management like park maintenance, gate closures, negotiating with the police and municipal personnel for sanitation and surveillance of dangerous rack pickers, hawkers, domestic workers, and slum dwellers. Ample work has shown that although in theory they are to function through regular elections and meetings, their inner institutional workings are often opaque, marked by scattered accountability and individual strongholds of leadership. Even in Jangpura-Bhogal, for example, 2 RWA presidents have led the associations for almost a decade without any elections, and have also established a symbiotic relationship with the Jangpura and Nizamuddin police post and station, local political figures, municipal representatives, and various intermediaries, such as the individual political unit members of the Aam Aadmi Party, the Congress, and the BJP. They often overlap with other associations. For example, these include colony associations like those of Jangpura A and their connections to the AAP Jangpura unit. Then you have the Bhogal Budh Vihar, which is connected to the Bhogal Vyapar Samiti, but the AAP Jangpura unit, but is also connected in some way to the BJP Jangpura unit. Some of these individuals have political ambitions beyond the neighborhood, while others argue that they are merely interested in what they call social service. Since the turn of the millennium, the active promotion of middle-class resident involvement in the Bhagidari scheme and the trifurcation, and then the undoing of that trifurcation now, of the DMC enabled these groups to stake claims in Jangpura-Bhogal. These collectives have taken different forms to make diverse infrastructural claims in defined space in Jangpura-Bhogal. There is also a literature on the middle class that highlights a retreat of this amorphous constituency from the, quote, messy domain of politics. And it has been accompanied by a state-sponsored involvement in governance rather than explicit politics to manage and improve urban space in line with ideas of what Asher Gertner calls the world-class city. Research on RWAs and elections argued that this division is in reality quite arbitrary, with local political candidates often overlapping in party and association memberships, using these associations as launch pads for their own careers. While it is true that the property neighborhood associations have been emboldened through bureaucratic fiat, bypassing an indirect conversation with local urban bodies and representatives, their historical relationship, although less explicit and intense, needs to be examined. Historically, the South Asian city has been marked by a differentiation of populations, playing out through planning's intersections with colonial difference, white and black town imaginaries, or class and status boundaries, for example. The middle class, in its various iterations, has benefited from several urban planning and political schemes across this history and utilized a variety of networks in urban civic politics since that time. These processes documented showcase the different power matrices around which resident collectives mobilize and should ideally be seen in a larger extended history of urban politics in Delhi. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Saeed, for this paper, which I really enjoyed and also was quite nostalgic for me because it reminded me of work that I had done in Jangpura and actually done in this building. So it's a coming together of two things. So I want to say, I think broadly, I think I would agree with your intervention if that is what you're trying to do, is to draw a longer genealogy of politics in the city. And I think one thing that you can try and think about actually is, which is something that occurred to me, is that actually in the process of doing these politics, there's another generation that learns how to do them, right? And therefore there is actually a language and a mode that gets, in a sense, learned and transferred, and therefore it kind of persists. But having said that, I will say some things too that have been said to me when I've tried to do this work. The first is, which is, of course, you yourself have pointed out, right, which is that actually the archive exists for the middle class city, right? And it's hard to get an archive for, although there might not be this separation between civil and political society, right? But it's hard to tell a history of any other group making these kinds of claims because it doesn't exist. And then there is the peculiarity of Delhi, which is being so highly regulated, right? But I would say, now that I don't work on Delhi anymore, but I still work on colonial governance, that one thing that has occurred to me is that there is, in a sense, a larger form here. When I started doing my work in Delhi, one of the things I did was to go and sit at the society registrar's office. And I started to write a list of all the associations that existed in the city from the day they came. At some point, I just quit because there were so many files, I just couldn't write them anymore. But I have a few decades, I think. So the idea of the association, right, it's not only about Delhi, right, that there's a form that exists, that and the other is the application, like the representation, right? Colonial archive is full of representation. Doesn't matter if you're cutting trees, building pipe, etc. And that has to do with the governance structure, right? There's this whole language of pleaders and etc. Yeah. But I will say two things for you to think about, which I have also thought about when I've done this work. One of the things about this transmission of language and form, though, is that happens and you see it on paper, right? Because the words they use, the language, the way it's done is similar. But the city is not the same place, right? So when you read about partition narratives and they're like, it's so congested, but it cannot be as congested as it is now, right? So you have to actually also think about, what is that difference? What does it actually mean in the moment, right? Not just in this genealogical form. And to that, I would say, as someone who did work in this moment of transition to this neoliberal city, which is what you said in the beginning, your intervention was, right? That it's not a disjuncture, that there is a continuity. Of course, that's true. I think I've also tried to show that. But I will say, though, that there are disjunctures, right? And it might be useful for you to think about what those disjunctures are, in the same way that the word congestion is present in the history of Delhi for every decade that you study it, right? But what does it actually mean in that moment? Because actually it's not the same city. Yeah. So it's something to think about. I'm not that I have a resolution for that. And even this micro history of Jangpura-Bhogal, because in the whole, the time that you're presenting, it is transforming in many different ways, right? So what does it mean? What do these forms mean in that context? Yeah, is, I think, important to consider, because since I know a little bit about the neighborhood, right? Is it about a middle class network versus everybody else? At a certain point, you could say that's true, right? There's certain parts, because the neighborhood is residentially differentiated, right? It actually has different sets of people, okay? So in that, you know that, right? So in that sense, but it also means that there are multiple claims being made at the same time, right? So can you tell a story where all of those, because sometimes things happen that people don't want, Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's, I think I'll just leave it there. But to try and think about this question, right, of what does these mean in the moment, in particular historical moments. When I presented my genealogy of RWAs, I was told I was being presentist, right? So now it's my turn to tell you. It's not that I'm saying you're being presentist, but it really made me think about, right, what does this word mean at this moment? What are the stakes, right? And not assume that the next decade the stakes are the same, even though the language remains the same. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will, of course, think about this. So I mean, in a sense, the one is that, of course, I mean, there are disjunctures. So I was only talking about a more extended history in terms of associational politics. But of course, like, it's very clear that there is this disjuncture that takes place in many aspects of the city. So I'm not negative.
The neighborhood is so much more anonymous.
Yeah.
Right. When you, like, 60s and 70s, it's not such an anonymous space.
Yeah.
But by the 90s, it's so anonymous. So
Yeah.
what do these politics mean in that space versus when you know, in that
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, the connections, of course, like, of course, there you have these very classic sort of neighborhood connections and residential populations, but there are these other connections which I show like in other work. So, for example, my recent paper on communal space, which is like when these connections sort of they actually go outside the neighborhood, outside the spatial boundaries of the neighborhood. So, for example, the Punjabi Suba movement. And these are sort of religious collectives, and the Punjabi Suba movement, which was so big in Punjab, comes to Delhi, and you have Sikhs who belong to the Akali Dal, residents in Bhogal, but they have like, there's across Lajpat Nagar, you have Lajpat Nagar becomes this stronghold of the Hindi language movement, while Bhogal and Jangpura becomes this Punjabi language, and this sort of, it leads to a number of clashes and sort of police presence and continuous riots, and the classic strategy of using religious processions to instigate communities, using particular slogans at particular points of time. That is happening, but it sort of links these, it goes beyond the immediate sort of caste boundaries or sort of spatial boundaries of these neighborhoods, or even something like the Bhogal Budhvihar, which is an entirely different and very interesting story of Thai monks who now run the space, but there have been like these shifting registers between the Ravidasiyas and the Navayan Buddhists, and then sort of a split between them, and then coming back together against these Thai monks. And that's a different story. I find it very fascinating, but I don't want to talk about it right now. But also, like, sort of as compared to, say, something like the Afghans live there, which, I mean, in my PhD thesis, I did sort of cover aspects of these emergent Afghan infrastructures that are completely sort of disconnected from these other ones that sort of came out during COVID and the sort of relief efforts that happened. Yeah.
So it's my great pleasure to thank you again, both Dr. Saeed Ahmed and Dr. Dia Mehra, for this very stimulating session. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to meeting all of you next semester. We are yet to define our program for the next semester, so I won't be able to give you the exact title of our next session, but we will welcome Professor Gyan Prakash on 13th of January. We'll send you more information about this very soon. Thank you again. Thank you.